The Montana winter of 1952 bit hard. Frost crept across the valley like a silent thief, turning everything it touched into crystalline sculptures of ice. In the heart of this unforgiving wilderness, a man named Thomas Brennan worked alone, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he shaped timber with tools that had belonged to his grandfather. Thomas was building a cabin. Not just any cabin, but one constructed with round logs, stripped of their bark but kept in their natural cylindrical form. His neighbors thought he had lost his mind. Every Saturday, when the local men gathered at Murphy's General Store in the small town of Clearwater Ridge, the conversation inevitably turned to Thomas and his peculiar construction methods. Jack Morrison, a logger with 30 years of experience, would shake his head and spit tobacco juice into the spittoon near the wood stove. "I've been cutting timber since before that boy was born," Jack would say, his voice thick with disdain. "Everyone knows you square the logs. You flatten at least 2 sides, preferably 4. That's how you build a cabin that lasts. Round logs? That's asking for gaps, for wind to whistle through, for the whole damn thing to collapse come spring thaw." The other men would nod in agreement, their weathered faces set in expressions of superiority. They had built their cabins the proper way, the way their fathers and grandfathers had done it. Each log carefully squared with adzes and draw knives, creating flat surfaces that stacked neatly, one atop another, with minimal gaps. Thomas heard the whispers. He felt the weight of their judgment every time he drove his old pickup truck into town for supplies. The hardware store owner would give him pitying looks when he purchased oakum and moss for chinking. The waitress at the diner would pause a moment too long when serving his coffee, her eyes filled with concern that he was wasting his money and time on a doomed project. But Thomas had his reasons. He had spent 2 years in forestry school before his father's death forced him to return home and take over the small family plot. During those years, he had studied under Professor Edmund Clark, a man who understood wood in ways that transcended tradition. The professor had taught him about moisture content, about how wood expands and contracts, about the science behind rot and decay. Round logs retain their structural integrity, the professor had explained during one memorable lecture. When you square a log, you cut through the sapwood and expose the more vulnerable inner layers. You create more surface area for moisture to penetrate. A round log, properly prepared and maintained, can outlast a squared one by decades. Thomas remembered every word. He remembered the diagrams, the cross-sections showing how water traveled through wood grain, how the natural curve of a round log actually helped shed water rather than trap it. He remembered the historical examples from Scandinavia and Russia, where round log construction had survived centuries. But here in Montana, tradition reigned supreme. Change was viewed with suspicion, and anyone who deviated from the established way of doing things was labeled a fool. Thomas worked alone through that brutal winter. His cabin rose slowly, each round log carefully selected, debarked, and notched. He used traditional saddle notches, cutting precisely so that each log locked into the one below it. Where his neighbors used simple squared notches that relied on weight to stay in place, Thomas crafted joints that interlocked, that distributed weight and stress in ways that actually strengthened with settling. His nearest neighbor, Dutch Henderson, lived half a mile down the valley. Dutch had built his cabin 5 years earlier, a handsome structure with perfectly squared logs, each corner sharp and true. Dutch would sometimes ride his horse up the trail to watch Thomas work, always offering unsolicited advice. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Thomas," Dutch would call out from his saddle. "All that careful notching, all that fuss. Just square them logs and stack them up. My cabin went up in half the time yours is taking." Thomas would nod politely and continue working. He knew what he was doing, even if no one else believed in him. He had calculated angles, had studied the grain of each log, had positioned his cabin to take advantage of natural drainage and prevailing winds. Every decision was deliberate, based on science rather than simply doing things because they had always been done that way. By spring, Thomas's cabin stood complete. Round logs formed walls that seemed to grow organically from the forest floor. The structure had a different aesthetic than the angular cabins that dotted the valley. It looked primitive to some eyes, less refined, less civilized. The criticism intensified. At church socials and town meetings, people would comment on how Thomas's cabin looked rough, unfinished. The squared log cabins had a geometry that appealed to the human eye, a sense of order and control over nature. Thomas's cabin looked like nature itself had been barely tamed. The humiliation reached its peak during the annual Clearwater Ridge Builders Festival in June. Every man who had constructed something significant in the past year was invited to present their work. Thomas arrived reluctantly, knowing his cabin would be on display for public judgment. The festival took place in the town square, where photographs of various construction projects lined makeshift boards. Dutch Henderson's expanded barn dominated the center display, its squared beams and precise angles drawing admiration from everyone who passed. Next to it hung images of Thomas's round log cabin. The contrast was stark and immediate. "Look at that mess." A voice rang out loud enough for half the crowd to hear. It was Jack Morrison, holding a beer and pointing directly at Thomas's photographs. "My 8-year-old grandson could stack logs straighter than that. What kind of craftsman leaves his logs looking like they just fell off the damn tree?" Laughter erupted from the cluster of men surrounding Jack. Thomas stood 15 feet away, frozen, his face burning with shame. He wanted to explain, to tell them about moisture barriers and structural integrity, about how the natural taper of his logs actually helped with water runoff. But the words caught in his throat. Dutch Henderson joined the group, shaking his head with exaggerated disappointment. "I tried to help him," Dutch announced to anyone within earshot. "Rode up there multiple times, offered advice. But Thomas here thinks he knows better than generations of Montana builders. Thinks his fancy book learning trumps actual experience." The festival judges, all veteran builders themselves, walked past Thomas's display with barely a glance. One of them, Harold Reeves, paused just long enough to mutter something about primitive construction techniques before moving on. They awarded Dutch Henderson first prize for his barn. Jack Morrison took second for a workshop addition he had built. Thomas received nothing, not even an honorable mention. That evening, as families gathered for the festival barbecue, Thomas sat alone at a corner table. Children ran past him, their parents pulling them back with warnings not to bother the strange man who built the weird cabin. He overheard Martha Collins, the schoolteacher, telling her friend that she felt sorry for Thomas, wasting his inheritance money on a structure that probably would not survive 5 winters. The bank manager, Stuart Phillips, approached Thomas with what he probably thought was kindness. "Thomas, I heard you put everything into that cabin. If you need a loan to rebuild it properly, to square those logs before they become a total loss, come see me. We can work something out." Thomas thanked him quietly and left the festival early. He drove home through the twilight, his truck rattling over the dirt road, his chest tight with anger and shame. When he reached his cabin, he sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the round logs that glowed amber in the setting sun. Everyone thought he was a fool. Everyone thought he had failed. 3 years passed like pages turning in a book nobody wanted to read. Thomas kept to himself, working his small timber plot, selling firewood to make ends meet. The mockery had subsided into indifference. People in Clearwater Ridge had moved on to newer gossip, though his cabin remained a cautionary tale parents told their sons about the dangers of ignoring tradition. Then came the autumn of 1955, and with it, the rains. Montana had seen wet seasons before, but this was different. September brought downpours that lasted days without pause. The valley became a maze of streams where dirt roads used to be. October continued the deluge. By November, the ground was so saturated that water had nowhere left to go except into the structures people had built. Thomas noticed it first on a cold morning in early December. He had driven into town for supplies and passed Dutch Henderson's property. Something about the cabin looked off. The corners seemed darker, almost black against the honey-colored logs. Thomas slowed his truck but did not stop. It was not his place to comment. 2 weeks later, Dutch appeared at Thomas's door. The proud man who had once offered pity now stood with his hat in his hands, his face drawn with worry. "Thomas, I need to ask you something. Your cabin, has it been holding up all right with all this rain?" Thomas nodded. "Had some minor chinking to redo in one spot, but nothing serious." "Why?" Dutch's shoulders sagged. My corners are rotting. All 4 of them. The wood's gone soft, black in places. Harold Reeves came by yesterday, said his workshop addition is showing the same problem. Jack Morrison's storage shed collapsed last week. Every squared log structure in the valley is falling apart. Thomas stepped outside with Dutch, and together they walked to Henderson's cabin. What Thomas saw confirmed his worst fears and his deepest knowledge. The squared corners, where flat surfaces met at 90-degree angles, had created perfect traps for moisture. Water had seeped into the exposed grain, had sat in those angular joints through months of rain, and had invited rot to feast on the wood. The damage was catastrophic. But your cabin, Dutch said quietly, almost afraid to ask. Why is yours not rotting? Thomas explained what Professor Clark had taught him years ago. The round logs shed water naturally. Their curved surfaces did not create pockets where moisture could accumulate. The saddle notches he had carved allowed for drainage and airflow. Where squared logs had flat surfaces that absorbed water like sponges, his round logs remained protected by their natural shape. If you're watching this story and you've ever been told your way was wrong, that your knowledge did not matter because it was not traditional, subscribe to this channel right now. Sometimes the truth takes time to reveal itself, but when it does, everything changes. Thomas's vindication was just beginning, and what happened next would transform an entire community's understanding of what real craftsmanship meant. Within a month, Thomas's phone rang constantly. Men who had laughed at him now begged for his help. Jack Morrison was the first to swallow his pride, appearing at Thomas's door on a gray January morning with his hat clutched against his chest. I was wrong, Jack said simply. My workshop is ruined. 20 years of tools sitting in a building that's rotting from the corners out. I need to rebuild, and I need to do it right. Will you teach me? Thomas could have refused. He could have let the bitterness of those festival humiliations poison his response. Instead, he invited Jack inside, spread blueprints across his kitchen table, and began explaining the principles Professor Clark had taught him years ago. Word spread like wildfire through Clearwater Ridge. The man they had mocked was now the only builder in the valley who understood how to construct structures that could withstand Montana's brutal climate. By February, Thomas had a waiting list of clients. By March, he was hiring assistants. Dutch Henderson became his first student. The 2 men worked side by side, dismantling Dutch's rotting cabin and rebuilding it with round logs. Dutch learned to read wood grain, to understand how moisture traveled through timber, to respect the natural properties of the material rather than forcing it into unnatural shapes. The transformation was not just in the buildings. It was in the men themselves. Harold Reeves, the festival judge who had dismissed Thomas's work, now sat in Thomas's cabin every Thursday evening, taking notes as Thomas lectured on wood science. The bank manager, Stuart Phillips, withdrew his condescending loan offer and instead asked Thomas to consult on the bank's new storage facility. By summer of 1956, the valley looked different. New round log structures rose alongside the old squared ones. The contrast was stark. Where squared log buildings showed black stains and soft wood at their corners, the round log constructions stood firm and sound, their curved surfaces gleaming with natural oils that repelled moisture. The annual Builders' Festival that June was a moment Thomas would never forget. He did not submit his work for judgment this time. He did not need to. Instead, the festival organizers asked him to be the keynote speaker. Thomas stood before 200 people, many of whom had ridiculed him 4 years earlier, and spoke about innovation, about the courage to trust knowledge over tradition, about how progress often looks like foolishness until time proves its worth. Jack Morrison stood in the front row, his face solemn. When Thomas finished speaking, Jack was the first to stand and applaud. Then Dutch rose. Then Harold. Within seconds, the entire crowd was on their feet, clapping for the man they had once considered the valley's greatest fool. The festival judges awarded Thomas a special recognition, not for a single building, but for changing the way an entire community understood their craft. His round log method was no longer a curiosity. It was the new standard. The pain of those years of mockery began to fade like morning frost under sunlight. Thomas found himself standing in a position he had never imagined, respected, sought after, and finally understood. The valley that had rejected him now depended on him. By autumn of 1956, Thomas had trained 15 apprentices in round log construction. His workshop, built adjacent to his original cabin, became a gathering place where old traditions met new understanding. Men who had built with squared logs for decades now came to learn why their methods had failed them. The local newspaper, the Clearwater Ridge Gazette, ran a feature story titled, "The Man Who Was Right All Along." The article detailed Thomas's journey from ridicule to recognition, and newspapers from Billings and even Helena picked up the story. Letters arrived from builders across Montana, from Idaho, from Wyoming, all asking for information about his techniques. Thomas answered every letter personally. He drew diagrams, explained moisture dynamics, shared the wisdom Professor Clark had given him years ago. He never charged for this knowledge. He remembered too well what it felt like to be alone with the truth while the world called you a fool. Jack Morrison became more than a student. He became a friend. The two men would sit on Thomas's porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the valley, discussing wood and weather and the strange paths life takes. Jack had dismantled his failed workshop and rebuilt it using round logs. The new structure stood solid and proud, and Jack would run his hand along the logs with something close to reverence. "I spent 30 years thinking I knew everything," Jack said one evening. "Took a catastrophe to teach me I knew nothing at all. You could have rubbed our noses in it, Thomas. You could have made us pay for how we treated you. But you did not. That says more about you than any cabin ever could." Dutch Henderson's rebuilt cabin became a showcase for the technique. People traveled from neighboring towns to see it, to understand how round logs could be both beautiful and functional. Dutch had painted a small sign above his door, "Built by Thomas Brennan Method 1956. He refused to take it down even when Thomas protested. "You gave me more than a cabin," Dutch told him. "You gave me back my pride. The least I can do is make sure people know who taught me." The festival judges privately apologized to Thomas, admitting they had let tradition blind them to innovation. Harold Reeves even asked Thomas to co-author an article for the Montana Builders Association Journal, documenting the round log method and its advantages. Thomas's original cabin, the one that had been photographed and ridiculed at that painful festival in 1953, was now photographed again. But this time, the images appeared in construction manuals and educational materials. Universities invited Thomas to speak. Professor Clark, now retired, wrote him a letter expressing pride in his former student. Justice had been served, not through revenge, but through time revealing truth. 20 years later, in the spring of 1976, Thomas Brennan sat on the same porch where he had once worked alone in shame. His hair had gone silver, his hands bore the calluses of decades working with wood, but his eyes held a contentment that came from a life lived with purpose. Clearwater Ridge had transformed. Nearly every new structure built in the valley since 1956 used round log construction. The method had spread across Montana, then throughout the Rocky Mountain states. Forestry programs at universities now taught the Brennan method as standard curriculum. What had once been considered foolish was now recognized as revolutionary. Thomas's original cabin still stood, now 44 years old, its round logs as sound as the day he had placed them. Meanwhile, most of the squared log cabins from that era had been demolished or completely rebuilt. The evidence was undeniable. Time had proven him right in ways no argument ever could. His business had grown beyond anything he imagined. Brennan Log Construction employed 37 people and had projects across 5 states. But Thomas still spent his mornings in the workshop, teaching new apprentices, ensuring the knowledge Professor Clark had given him would pass to another generation. Dutch Henderson, now in his 70s, still lived in the cabin Thomas had helped him rebuild. They remained close friends, sharing coffee most Sunday mornings, their conversation a comfortable mix of silence and reflection. Jack Morrison had passed away 2 years earlier, but not before telling his grandchildren the story of how Thomas Brennan had saved the valley with knowledge everyone had been too proud to accept. On this particular spring morning, a young man arrived at Thomas's door. He was a university student, working on a thesis about innovation in traditional crafts. He asked Thomas the question everyone asked, How did it feel to be vindicated after years of mockery? Thomas thought for a long moment before answering. The vindication was not about proving them wrong. It was about the buildings still standing. It was about the men who learned to trust knowledge over tradition. It was about understanding that being right is not about winning an argument. It is about time revealing truth. The student nodded, writing furiously in his notebook. Thomas smiled, remembering the young man he had once been, working alone in the Montana cold, trusting what he knew even when the entire world disagreed. His round logs stood sound while squared ones had rotted away. But more than that, he had taught a community that wisdom sometimes arrives in unexpected forms, carried by those brave enough to stand alone until the world catches up. Thank you for watching this story until the very end. If it moved you, if it reminded you that truth always finds its way to the surface, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling us about a time when you trusted your knowledge even when others doubted you. What stories would you like to hear next? Your suggestions help us create content that truly matters. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest strength is standing firm when everyone else tells you to bend.